The crystal chandeliers sparkled like frozen fireworks above the crowded ballroom. Women in silk gowns glided past men in tailored tuxedos, everyone holding champagne glasses that caught the light just right. This wasn't just any party. This was the kind of event where a single dinner plate cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was a charity gala in Manhattan, one of those fancy fundraisers where rich people gathered to write big checks and feel good about themselves. The cause was noble enough, helping refugees rebuild their lives in America. But let's be honest, most people were there to see and be seen, to make connections, to add another glamorous event to their social calendar. Near the bar, a man in his early 40s stood surrounded by a small crowd of admirers. Let's call him David Chen. David had made his fortune in technology, something to do with apps and algorithms that regular people didn't really understand. What they did understand was that he was worth about $80 million, and in rooms like this, money talked louder than anything else. David was doing what he did best, holding court. His voice carried that particular confidence that comes from never having to worry about a price tag. He was telling a story about his latest business trip to Singapore, dropping names of CEOs and politicians like they were old college buddies. The people around him laughed at all the right moments, nodded at all the right times. The problem with international business, David was saying, swirling his scotch, is that everyone thinks they can navigate different cultures. They take a few language classes, memorize some phrases, and suddenly they think they're experts. A woman in a red dress laughed a little too enthusiastically. "Oh, I know exactly what you mean. I took French for 3 years and I can barely order a croissant." David smiled, enjoying the attention. "Exactly. And don't even get me started on people who claim to speak multiple languages. Real fluency? That takes decades. Most people who say they speak 4 or 5 languages are just fooling themselves. They know enough to get by in a tourist shop, maybe order at a restaurant, but having an actual conversation? Forget it." The group murmured their agreement. None of them spoke more than one language, maybe a bit of high school Spanish they'd long forgotten. So David's words felt like permission to dismiss anyone who claimed otherwise. It made them feel better about their own limitations. That's when she walked in. Nobody noticed her at first. She wasn't trying to make an entrance. No dramatic pause at the doorway. No flashy dress designed to turn heads. She wore a simple navy dress that looked nice but wasn't designer, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She looked like she might be someone's assistant, maybe a coordinator for the event. Her name was Nina Volkov, and she was 28 years old. She'd been invited by one of the board members, a kind woman who knew about Nina's volunteer work with refugee families. Nina hadn't wanted to come. She felt out of place at events like this, surrounded by wealth she couldn't imagine. But the board member had insisted, said it would be good for Nina to meet potential supporters of her work. Nina grabbed a glass of water from a passing server and stood near the edge of the room, taking it all in. She watched the clusters of people laughing and networking, everyone seeming so comfortable in this world of luxury. She thought about the family she'd helped yesterday, a mother and 3 kids from Syria, living in a tiny apartment in Queens, trying to figure out how to enroll the children in school when none of them spoke English yet. The contrast between that cramped apartment and this glittering ballroom made her chest tight. "Nina." "There you are." The board member, Mrs. Peterson, appeared at her elbow, smiling warmly. She was one of those rare wealthy people who actually seemed to care about the cause, not just the social status it brought. "I'm so glad you made it. Come, I want you to meet some people." Before Nina could protest, Mrs. Peterson was guiding her through the crowd. They approached David's circle just as he was wrapping up another story. Mrs. Peterson didn't hesitate. She just stepped right into the group with the confidence of someone who belonged. "David, I want to introduce you to someone special," Mrs. Peterson said brightly. "This is Nina Volkov. She does incredible work with our refugee families, translation, cultural orientation, helping them navigate everything from doctor's appointments to job interviews." David turned, his expression polite but not particularly interested. He probably met a dozen people like this at every event, volunteers and do-gooders who wanted to talk his ear off about their causes. He extended his hand automatically. "Nice to meet you," he said, his tone friendly but distant. "You too," Nina replied quietly, shaking his hand. Her grip was firm but brief. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Mrs. Peterson, bless her heart, was trying to help. "Nina is fluent in 9 languages. Can you imagine? She's absolutely invaluable to our organization. The effect was immediate. David's expression shifted from polite disinterest to barely concealed amusement. His eyebrows went up and a smile played at the corners of his mouth. Around him, the other guests exchanged glances, some trying to hide their own skeptical smirks. 9 languages? David repeated, and there it was, that tone. The one that said he didn't believe a word of it. Really? That's quite a claim. The woman in the red dress giggled. Someone else coughed to cover a laugh. Nina felt her stomach drop. She knew that look, that tone. She'd seen it before, though rarely this directly. The doubt, the dismissal, the assumption that she was exaggerating or lying. Yes, she said simply, meeting his eyes. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no need to prove herself. It was just a fact. David took a sip of his scotch, his smile widening. He glanced at his audience, making sure they were all watching, all in on the joke. 9 languages, wow, that's impressive. I mean, I meet a lot of people who say they speak multiple languages, but 9? That's a new record. The way he said it made it clear he thought she was either delusional or a liar. Maybe both. Someone in the group laughed outright this time. Not a mean laugh exactly, but the kind of laugh that happens when everyone agrees something is ridiculous and they're all in on it together. Nina felt heat rise to her cheeks. Not from anger, not exactly. It was more complicated than that. It was the exhaustion of constantly having to prove herself, of being dismissed before she even had a chance to speak. It was the weight of knowing that no matter what she said next, David had already decided she wasn't worth taking seriously. Mrs. Peterson, sensing the shift in energy, tried to smooth things over. Nina really is remarkable, David. She's helped hundreds of families. But David was on a roll now, emboldened by his audience. I'm sure she's very helpful, he said, his voice dripping with patronizing kindness. And knowing a few key phrases in different languages, that's great, that's useful. But actual fluency in 9 languages? Come on. That's the kind of thing people put on their resume to sound more interesting than they are. He said it with a chuckle, like he was being charming and witty rather than insulting, like Nina should appreciate his honesty, his willingness to call out an obvious exaggeration. The group around him laughed again, louder this time. They felt safe doing it now that David had set the tone. Nobody wanted to disagree with the millionaire after all. Nobody wanted to be the one who didn't get the joke. Nina stood very still. Her face remained calm, composed. Only the slight tightness around her eyes betrayed anything. She looked at David for a long moment and something passed between them. A moment where he could have backed down, could have realized he'd gone too far. But he didn't. He just smiled that confident, dismissive smile and took another sip of his drink. Excuse me, Nina said quietly. Her voice was steady, polite. I think I'll get some food. She turned and walked away, her head held high. Mrs. Peterson shot David a disappointed look before hurrying after Nina, but Nina waved her off gently. It's fine, she said, though they both knew it wasn't. Behind her, Nina could hear David's group returning to their conversation, someone making another joke, the laughter continuing. To them, she was already forgotten, just another awkward moment at a long evening of small talk. Nina made her way to the hors d'oeuvres table and picked up a small plate she didn't want. Her hands were steady, but inside something was shifting. She'd spent years being underestimated, years having her abilities questioned, years being treated like her experiences weren't real, because they didn't fit into people's narrow understanding of what was possible. Usually, she let it go. What was the point of arguing? People believed what they wanted to believe, but tonight, standing in this ballroom full of people who'd never had to fight for anything, who'd never had to learn a language just to survive, who'd never known what it felt like to be a stranger in a strange land. Tonight, something hardened in her chest. She set down her plate and turned back to look at the crowd. Somewhere in that sea of designer clothes and careless laughter was a man who'd just dismissed her entire life with a giggle. He had no idea who she was, where she'd come from, what she'd survived. He had no idea what was coming. Nina took a deep breath and smoothed her dress. The evening was far from over, and sometimes the universe has a funny way of creating teaching moments. She'd learned a long time ago that the best response. Across the room, David was already deep into another conversation, another story about his success and wisdom. He'd probably already forgotten the brief encounter with the woman who claimed to speak 9 languages. It was just another moment of entertainment, another chance to show his sophistication to his admirers. He had no idea that in about an hour, his entire evening and possibly his entire perspective was about to be turned completely upside down. The chandeliers continued to sparkle overhead. The champagne continued to flow, and the party went on like parties always do. But something had been set in motion. A small stone tossed into still water, ripples spreading outward in ways no one could predict yet. Nina stood by the window now, looking out at the glittering Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there in apartments and shelters and community centers across the city were the families she worked with. People who'd crossed oceans and deserts to find safety, who'd left everything behind, who were rebuilding their lives one word, one connection, one small victory at a time. She thought about them and felt her resolve strengthen. This wasn't about her pride. This was bigger than one rude millionaire at one fancy party. This was about every person who'd ever been dismissed, doubted or underestimated because they didn't fit someone's narrow expectations. And sometimes, those people get a chance to prove exactly what they're made of. Nina was still standing by the window when the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. The chatter died down as someone tapped a microphone on stage. Mrs. Peterson was up there now, smiling at the crowd with that practiced ease of someone who'd given 1,000 speeches at 1,000 similar events. "Good evening, everyone." Mrs. Peterson's voice echoed through the sound system. "Thank you all for being here tonight and for your incredible generosity. Your support changes lives in ways you can't even imagine." The crowd applauded politely. Nina noticed David near his table, still surrounded by his admirers, barely paying attention. He was checking his phone, probably scrolling through emails or stock prices or whatever millionaires looked at during charity events. "Tonight," Mrs. Peterson continued, "we have a very special guest. I'm honored to introduce Ambassador Takashi Yamamoto from Japan, who's here to share his perspective on the global refugee crisis and the work being done internationally." The applause was warmer this time. An elderly Japanese man in a distinguished suit walked onto the stage, bowing slightly to the audience. He looked to be in his 70s with kind eyes and silver hair. Behind him, a younger woman in business attire followed, clearly his interpreter. Nina found herself paying attention now. She'd read about Ambassador Yamamoto. He'd spent 40 years in diplomatic service, working on humanitarian issues across Asia and the Middle East. He was the real deal, someone who actually understood what refugees faced. The ambassador began speaking in Japanese, his voice strong despite his age. The interpreter stood beside him, waiting for him to pause so she could translate. But something was off. Nina could hear it immediately. The ambassador was speaking in a formal, classical style of Japanese, mixed with a regional dialect from northern Japan. It was beautiful, poetic even, but the interpreter looked confused. The ambassador finished his first sentence and paused. The interpreter fumbled with her notes, then spoke into her microphone. "The ambassador says he is happy to be here tonight and to talk about the refugee situation." Nina winced. That wasn't what he'd said at all. The ambassador had opened with a traditional greeting that referenced an old Japanese proverb about cherry blossoms and renewal. He'd compared refugees to seeds scattered by the wind, capable of growing beautiful things in new soil if given the chance. It was profound and moving. The interpreter had reduced it to "happy to be here." The ambassador continued, not seeming to notice the problem. But Nina noticed, and she could see Mrs. Peterson on the side of the stage, her smile looking a bit strained. Then disaster struck. The teleprompter screen behind the stage flickered once, twice, and went completely black. Someone in the tech booth swore loud enough that the microphone picked it up. The ambassador paused mid-sentence, confused. The interpreter looked panicked. All her notes had been on that teleprompter. The ambassador said something in Japanese, a question. The interpreter froze. The ambassador wants to know." He's asking. She couldn't understand him. Without her prepared script, she was lost. The formal dialect, the speed of his speech, the cultural context, it was too much. Her face went red. The ballroom filled with uncomfortable murmurs. People shifted in their seats. David glanced up from his phone, finally interested now that something was going wrong. There's something about watching important events fall apart that captures everyone's attention. Mrs. Peterson hurried onto the stage, trying to salvage the situation. She spoke quietly to the ambassador, who looked apologetic and confused. This was supposed to be the highlight of the evening, and it was collapsing in real time. Nina didn't think. She just moved. She walked quickly toward the stage, her simple dress suddenly feeling very out of place as she climbed the steps. Mrs. Peterson saw her coming, and relief flooded her face. She remembered Nina spoke Japanese. She'd mentioned it when they first met, something about helping a Japanese family navigate the immigration system. "Can you help?" Mrs. Peterson whispered urgently. Nina nodded and approached the ambassador. She bowed properly, the exact depth and duration appropriate for addressing someone of his status. Then she spoke in Japanese, formal and respectful, explaining that she could interpret if he was comfortable with that. The ambassador's whole face lit up. He responded in rapid Japanese, and Nina understood every word. More than that, she understood the emotion behind the words, the cultural context, the subtle meanings that pure translation always missed. Nina turned to the microphone. "The ambassador appreciates your patience. He'd like to continue sharing his message about the strength and resilience of refugee communities worldwide." Her voice was clear, confident. This was different from the quiet woman who'd been dismissed by David an hour earlier. This was Nina in her element. The ambassador began speaking again, and this time Nina moved with him. She didn't just translate words. She captured his meaning, his passion, his decades of experience. When he spoke about meeting a young refugee girl who'd walked 300 miles to safety, Nina's voice carried that same weight. When he described the look in that girl's eyes, exhausted but unbroken, the ballroom fell completely silent. People weren't checking their phones anymore. They were listening. David sat forward in his chair. His date noticed and raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that the woman from earlier?" she whispered. "Yeah," David said slowly, watching Nina on stage. "I think so." The ambassador spoke for 5 more minutes, and Nina matched him perfectly. Every pause, every emphasis, every subtle shift in tone, she caught it all. When he finished his opening remarks, the applause was genuine, moved. The ambassador turned to Nina and bowed deeply, a gesture of real respect. She returned it. Mrs. Peterson started to thank everyone and move on with the program, clearly relieved the crisis had been averted. But then something unplanned happened. A couple stood up from a table near the back. They looked out of place too, not dressed in formal wear. The man wore a simple suit that had seen better days, and the woman had a scarf covering her hair. They looked nervous, like they weren't sure if they were allowed to speak. "Please," the man called out in heavily accented English. "We want to say something. We are from Ukraine. This organization helped us." Mrs. Peterson hesitated, looking at her program schedule, but the room erupted in supportive applause. People wanted to hear from them. These were the real stories, the ones that mattered. The couple made their way to the stage, holding hands like they were anchoring each other. Up close, Nina could see they were probably in their 50s, but they looked older. That's what war and loss does to people. It ages them in ways that have nothing to do with years. The man took the microphone with shaking hands and began to speak. Not in English this time, but in Ukrainian, fast, emotional Ukrainian. His voice cracked as he talked about their home in Kharkiv, about the sounds of explosions that woke them in the middle of the night, about the decision to leave everything behind. His wife stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. The crowd didn't understand a word, but they understood the emotion. Several people were crying just watching them. Nina stepped forward. She didn't ask permission this time, didn't wait for an invitation. She just began interpreting, her voice strong where his was breaking, carrying his words to a room full of people who'd never known that kind of fear. "We left with nothing," Nina translated, and her voice made everyone feel the weight of that nothing. "Our home is rubble now. Our neighbors are gone. We came here with one suitcase between us and hearts full of hope that somewhere, someone would help us start again," the man continued, describing how this organization had given them food, shelter, help with paperwork, how Nina herself had sat with them for hours, translating documents, making phone calls, helping them find an apartment. His wife squeezed his hand tighter. "This woman," the man said, pointing at Nina, speaking through tears. "She spoke to us in our language when we thought we'd never hear it again. She made us feel human when we felt like ghosts." Nina translated his words, but her own voice was thick now. This was why she did this work. Not for recognition, not for praise, but for moments like this, when someone who'd lost everything found a small piece of home in their own language. The ballroom exploded in applause. People were standing now, wiping their eyes. Even the servers along the walls were clapping, but the evening wasn't done surprising everyone. An elderly man at another table stood up slowly. He was Middle Eastern, probably in his 70s, with a weathered face that told 1,000 stories. He didn't walk to the stage. He just stood at his table and began to speak in Arabic, his voice carrying in the quiet room. Nina turned toward him, and without missing a beat, she began to interpret. Not from the stage now, but from where she stood, projecting her voice across the room. The man was Syrian. He'd been a teacher in Damascus before the war. He talked about his school, his students, his life he talked about losing his son, about the journey to America at an age when he should have been surrounded by grandchildren, not starting over in a country where he couldn't read street signs. But here, Nina translated, her voice carrying his dignity, his pain, his persistent hope. I found people who saw me, who didn't just see a refugee, a problem, a statistic. They saw a teacher, a father, a human being. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear people breathing, sniffling, trying to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't a planned program. This was raw, real, honest. David sat frozen at his table. His scotch sat untouched. He was staring at Nina like he was seeing her for the first time. Around the ballroom, everyone was doing the same. That was 3 languages. In less than 20 minutes, Nina had seamlessly switched between Japanese, Ukrainian, and Arabic. Not just switching, mastering, capturing nuance and emotion and cultural context in each one. The woman in the red dress at David's table leaned over. Didn't you say she was exaggerating? David didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt tight. Nina helped the elderly Syrian man sit back down, speaking to him in Arabic, her hand on his shoulder. The genuine affection between them was obvious. This wasn't a performance. These were her people. This was her life. Mrs. Peterson returned to the microphone, visibly moved. I think we've all just witnessed something extraordinary, she said, her voice thick. This is the work we do. This is why we're here. Nina Volkov represents the heart of our organization. Someone who builds bridges between worlds, who reminds us that language is more than words. It's connection. It's humanity. The applause started again, but Nina was already leaving the stage. She didn't want attention. She never had. She just wanted to get back to doing the work. But as she walked past David's table, their eyes met. His expression had completely changed. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by something else. Confusion, maybe, or the first stirrings of understanding that he'd made a serious mistake. Nina didn't stop, didn't say anything. She just walked past, head high, back to her spot by the window. David watched her go. His mind was racing. 3 languages. Perfect fluency in all 3. And that didn't include the English she'd been speaking all night. How many more could she actually speak? Was 9 really possible? His date touched his arm. Are you okay? You look weird. I think, David said slowly. I just made a really big mistake. Around them, the party was transforming. People weren't networking anymore. They were talking about what they'd just witnessed. About the Ukrainian couple, the Syrian man, the ambassador. About Nina. Several guests approached Mrs. Peterson, wanting to increase their donations, wanting to know more about the organization's work. The emotional testimony had done more in 20 minutes than 1,000 prepared speeches could have done. But David barely noticed any of that. He was too busy replaying the earlier conversation in his head. The way he'd laughed. The way he'd dismissed her. The way everyone had joined in because he'd set that tone. He'd just publicly mocked someone who was apparently exactly what she'd claimed to be. And not just that. Someone who was using those abilities to do genuinely important work. Work that actually changed lives. His phone buzzed. A text from a business colleague who'd been at another table. Dude, isn't that the woman you were laughing about earlier? Awkward. David closed his eyes. Yeah. Awkward didn't even begin to cover it. Across the room, Nina stood alone again, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. She hadn't wanted to make a scene. She never wanted to prove herself like that. But sometimes the universe has a way of creating moments that need to happen. She thought about David's laugh, his dismissive tone, the way everyone had joined in. She'd dealt with that kind of thing her whole life. But tonight, for once, the truth had spoken louder than doubt. 3 languages down, 6 more to go, if anyone was still counting. But Nina wasn't thinking about that. She was thinking about the Ukrainian couple, about the tears in their eyes, about the Syrian teacher and the weight of his memories. about the Japanese ambassador and his beautiful words about refugees being seeds in the wind. This was what language meant to her. Not a party trick, not a resume booster. It was the thing that connected broken people to hope. It was the bridge between the life they'd lost and the life they were trying to build. And if a certain millionaire with a big mouth and a closed mind had learned something tonight, well, that was just a bonus. The evening was far from over. But already, nothing would ever be quite the same. The thing about humiliation is that it hits different when you deserve it. David couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head. The giggle. That stupid, dismissive giggle. He'd been so sure of himself, so confident that this woman was exaggerating, showing off, trying to seem more impressive than she actually was. He'd been wrong. Spectacularly, publicly wrong. The party continued around him, but David felt disconnected from it all. His date had given up trying to make conversation with him. She was chatting with the woman in the red dress now, probably gossiping about something he didn't care about. Usually David would be working the room, making connections, collecting business cards. Tonight he just sat there, his expensive scotch getting warm in his hand. He couldn't see Nina anymore. She'd disappeared into the crowd after the testimonies. Part of him wanted to go find her to apologize right now. But a bigger part of him, the coward part if he was being honest, didn't want to face her yet. What would he even say? "You okay?" His date asked, noticing his silence. "Yeah," David lied. "Just thinking." She gave him a look that said she didn't believe him, but she let it go. That was the thing about dating in his circle. Everyone was too polite to push too hard. Surface-level conversations, surface-level relationships, surface-level everything. 20 minutes later, David saw Nina again. She was talking quietly with Mrs. Peterson near the entrance, looking like she was getting ready to leave. Something in David's chest tightened. If she left now, he'd have to track her down to apologize, make it into this big thing. Better to do it now, get it over with. He stood up before he could talk himself out of it. "Where are you going?" his date asked. "Just need to talk to someone. Be right back." He crossed the ballroom, weaving through clusters of people, his heart beating faster than it should. This was ridiculous. He was a successful businessman. He'd negotiated million-dollar deals, given presentations to boards of directors, fired people without blinking. Why was he nervous about talking to one woman? "Because you humiliated her," his conscience whispered. "In front of everyone, and she didn't deserve it." Nina saw him coming. Her expression didn't change, just stayed neutral and calm. Mrs. Peterson noticed him too and excused herself, probably sensing this needed to happen in private. David stopped a few feet away from Nina, suddenly aware that he had no idea how to start this conversation. "Hi," he said, which felt incredibly stupid the moment it left his mouth. "Hello," Nina replied. Her voice was polite but distant. She wasn't going to make this easy for him, and honestly, he didn't blame her. "Listen, about earlier." David started, then stopped. The words felt clumsy in his mouth. "I was completely out of line. The way I reacted when Mrs. Peterson introduced you, the things I said. I'm sorry. That was really inappropriate." Nina watched him steadily. She didn't jump to say it's okay or don't worry about it like people usually did when someone apologized. She just waited for him to continue. David felt sweat prickling at his collar. "I made assumptions about you based on literally nothing. I was dismissive and rude, and you didn't deserve that." "No," Nina agreed quietly. "I didn't." The simple honesty of her response hit him harder than anger would have. She wasn't trying to be mean or make him feel worse. She was just stating a fact. "What you did up there tonight," David continued, gesturing toward the stage. "That was incredible. The way you helped those people share their stories, the way you connected with them. That wasn't just translation. That was something else entirely." "That's what real language ability is," Nina said. There was no smugness in her voice, no need to rub it in. She was just explaining. "It's not about memorizing vocabulary or passing tests. It's about understanding people. Their culture, their pain, their hopes. Words without context are just noise." David nodded, feeling like a student being gently corrected by a teacher. "How did you learn so many languages?" Nina hesitated. Most people didn't really want to know the answer to that question. They wanted a simple explanation, something inspirational but not too heavy. But something in David's expression made her think he might actually want the truth. "I grew up in a refugee camp," she said simply. "After my family fled from ethnic violence in Azerbaijan. I was 6 years old." David's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. The camp was in Turkey, so I learned Turkish, but my parents spoke Russian at home, so I already had that. There were Syrian families in the camp, Afghan families, Iranian families. We were all stuck there together, sometimes for years. Kids learn languages fast when they need to communicate, when making friends depends on it. She said it matter-of-factly, but David could imagine what she wasn't saying. The fear, the uncertainty, the childhood spent in temporary shelters waiting for a future that might never come. When we finally got to America, I was 12, Nina continued. English became my fifth language, I guess. Then in school I studied French and German because I was good at languages and they were useful. Later I learned Mandarin and Japanese for work, helping refugee families from those regions. 9 languages, David said quietly. You really weren't exaggerating. No, Nina said, and there was finally a hint of something sharper in her voice. I wasn't, but you know what the worst part was? It wasn't that you didn't believe me. It's that you laughed. You made it into a joke, and everyone around you felt safe laughing too because you set that tone. David felt his face flush. I know, and I'm sorry. I was showing off, trying to seem knowledgeable in front of people. I do that sometimes. Too often, probably. Why? Nina asked, genuinely curious now. You're obviously successful. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. That question hit deeper than David expected. Why did he do that? Why did he always need to be the smartest person in the room? The one with all the answers, the authority everyone deferred to? I don't know, he admitted. Habit, maybe? Insecurity masquerading as confidence. Take your pick. Nina's expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness exactly, but at least understanding that he was being honest. Can I ask you something? David said. When Mrs. Peterson mentioned your languages earlier, you could have responded to my doubt right then. You could have said something, defended yourself. Why didn't you? Nina smiled slightly, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Because I've learned that people who doubt you aren't really asking for proof. They've already made up their minds. Arguing with them just makes them dig in deeper, so I wait. Eventually, the truth shows itself. And tonight it did, David said. Tonight it did, Nina agreed. They stood in silence for a moment. The party continued around them, but they existed in their own bubble of conversation. David thought about all the times he'd dismissed people, made snap judgments, decided someone wasn't worth his time based on first impressions. How many other Ninas had he encountered? How many people had he underestimated because they didn't fit his narrow view of what impressive looked like? What you said earlier about me thinking fluency in multiple languages was impossible just because I could barely speak 2, David said slowly. That actually got to me. I do that a lot, don't I? Assume that if I can't do something, it must be really hard or impossible for anyone else. Nina tilted her head, considering him. Most people do that. It's human nature to use ourselves as the measuring stick. But it's limiting. For you and for the people you're judging. So what do I do? David asked. How do I fix that? Nina looked at him for a long moment. Why are you asking me? You don't know me. I'm just someone you met at a party. Because I think you might be one of the smartest people in this room, David said honestly. And I almost missed that completely because I was too busy being impressed with myself. That answer seemed to surprise Nina. She studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation. But David had never been more genuine in his life. You want real advice? Nina asked. Yeah, David said. I really do. Stop writing checks to feel good about yourself and actually get involved. You're here at a charity event for refugees, but I'm guessing you don't actually know any refugees personally. You probably don't know what they need, what they struggle with, what would actually help, versus what just makes donors feel generous. The words were blunt, but David found himself nodding. She was absolutely right. The people who do the most good aren't usually the ones with the most money, Nina continued. They're the ones who show up, who listen, who see people as humans instead of statistics or causes. You want to make a difference? Learn to do that by learning languages? David asked. Nina laughed, a real laugh this time. Languages help, but that's not what I mean. I mean learn to listen without planning what you're going to say next. Learn to ask questions because you actually want to know the answer, not because you're looking for a way to talk about yourself. Learn to sit with discomfort instead of filling every silence with your own voice. David felt like he'd just been given a masterclass in humility. You're really not going to go easy on me, are you? You laughed at me in front of a room full of people, Nina said simply. Why would I go easy on you? Fair point. Okay, David said. You're right. About all of it. So where do I start? Nina seemed surprised by that. Most rich people, in her experience, didn't actually want to change. They wanted to be told they were fine the way they were, that their money was enough, that showing up to fancy fundraisers counted as making a difference. You really want to know? She asked. I really do, David confirmed. Nina thought for a moment. Come volunteer with me. Not as a donor or a board member. Come as someone who's there to help. We have a community center in Queens where we run ESL classes, help with job applications, teach people how to navigate the subway system. Basic stuff that makes a huge difference to people who are starting over. David blinked. You want me to volunteer? Like actually show up and work? Yes, Nina said. That's generally what volunteering means. I don't speak any other languages, David protested. I wouldn't be any help. You speak English, don't you? That's what people are trying to learn. You can have conversations with them, help them practice. You can share what you know about business, about succeeding in America. You can listen to their stories and see them as people instead of problems to be solved with money. David felt resistance rising in him. His schedule was packed. He had meetings, calls, obligations. He didn't have time to volunteer at a community center in Queens, but then he thought about Nina's words. About showing up. About learning to listen. About the look on the Ukrainian couple's faces when they'd shared their story. About the elderly Syrian teacher who'd lost his son. Okay, he heard himself say. When? Now it was Nina's turn to look surprised. Really? Really, David confirmed, and he meant it. You're right. I throw money at problems and tell myself that's enough. But tonight made me realize I don't actually know anything about the people I'm supposedly helping. So yeah, tell me when and where, and I'll be there. Nina studied him for a moment, probably trying to figure out if he was serious or if this was just another performance. David met her gaze steadily, letting her see that he meant it. Thursday night, Nina finally said. 6 o'clock. I'll send you the address through Mrs. Peterson. Thursday at 6, David repeated. I'll be there. Don't dress fancy, Nina added, a hint of amusement in her voice. And don't expect anyone to care who you are or how much money you have. In that room, you're just David, another person trying to help. Just David, he echoed. When was the last time he'd been just anything? When was the last time he'd walked into a room where his money and status didn't precede him? He was about to say something else when Nina's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. I need to take this. It's one of my family's. Of course, David said, stepping back. Nina answered in what sounded like Arabic, her whole demeanor shifting into work mode. She listened intently, asked quick questions, her face showing concern. David watched her, fascinated by the transformation. This was Nina in her element, doing what she was meant to do. She finished the call and looked apologetic. I have to go. There's an emergency with a family I work with. Their landlord is trying to evict them and they don't understand the paperwork. At this hour? David asked. Emergencies don't wait for business hours, Nina said, already heading for the door. I'll see you Thursday. And just like that, she was gone. No dramatic exit, no final words. She just left because someone needed her, because the work was more important than the party. David stood there watching her go, feeling like he'd just had one of the most significant conversations of his life with someone he'd dismissed as a fraud less than 3 hours ago. His date appeared at his elbow. Was that the language girl? Did you apologize? Yeah, David said absently, still watching the door where Nina had disappeared. Good. That was so embarrassing earlier. Everyone was talking about it after she did that whole translation thing. Are you ready to leave? This party's getting boring. But David barely heard her. He was thinking about Thursday night, about showing up as just David, about learning to listen instead of always needing to speak, about how much he didn't know and how good it might feel to finally admit that. The party wound down around him, but David's evening was just beginning. He pulled out his phone and started clearing his Thursday schedule. No meetings, no calls, no excuses. He had a community center to visit, and maybe, just maybe, he had something to learn from the woman he'd laughed at, the woman who'd just taught him more in 20 minutes than most people had in years. David spent the next 3 days doing something he rarely did. Research that had nothing to do with making money. He wanted to understand who Nina really was before Thursday came around. Not because he was looking for ammunition or trying to one-up her. He was genuinely curious about the woman who'd managed to humble him so completely. He started simple, asking Mrs. Peterson for information. She was more than happy to talk about Nina, clearly delighted that someone was finally taking interest in the organization's most dedicated volunteer. "She's been with us for 4 years," Mrs. Peterson told him over coffee. "Started as a volunteer translator and just kept expanding what she did. Now she's basically running our entire cultural integration program, and we can barely afford to pay her a stipend." "Wait," David said. "She doesn't get paid?" "Not really. We give her a small monthly amount, maybe $1,500 to cover transportation and supplies. But compared to what corporate translators make, she could be earning 6 figures easily. Instead, she's helping families fill out housing applications in a basement community center." David sat back, processing this. $1,500 a month in New York City? That was barely enough to survive. "Why does she do it?" Mrs. Peterson smiled. "Why don't you ask her yourself on Thursday?" So David kept digging. He found articles about Nina online. Not many, but a few. There was a piece from a community newspaper about a workshop she'd led for Afghan refugees, helping them preserve their native language while learning English. Another article mentioned her work with the UN on a temporary basis, interpreting for asylum hearings. Then he found a video. It was from a small talk she'd given at a local college, part of a series on humanitarian work. The video quality was poor, clearly shot on someone's phone, but David watched the entire 40-minute presentation twice. In it, Nina told stories that made David's comfortable life feel incredibly small. She talked about a grandmother from Somalia, who'd survived 3 civil wars and a refugee camp, only to struggle with ordering food at a New York deli because the staff got impatient with her broken English. Nina had spent an afternoon teaching that woman common phrases, but more than that. She'd gone back to that deli and explained to the staff about patience, about seeing people's humanity before their language skills. She told another story about a teenage boy from Afghanistan who'd been a straight-A student before the war, spoke 4 languages and dreamed of being a doctor. In America, he was placed in remedial classes because his English wasn't perfect yet. His talents invisible to a system that only measured one kind of intelligence. Nina had advocated for him, tutored him, helped him transfer to appropriate classes. He was now in college pre-med. "Languages aren't just words," Nina said in the video, her face earnest and tired in a way that showed she'd been doing this work for a long time. Their identity. When someone loses their language, when they can't communicate in the tongue they grew up with, they lose a part of themselves. "My job isn't just helping people learn English. It's helping them hold on to who they are while becoming who they need to be to survive here." David closed his laptop and sat in his expensive apartment, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. He'd built businesses, made millions, considered himself successful by every metric society valued. But he'd never done anything that mattered the way Nina's work mattered. Not even close. Thursday arrived faster than David expected. He stood in front of his closet that evening, Nina's words echoing in his head. "Don't dress fancy." He pushed past the designer suits and settled on jeans and a plain sweater. Looking at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the casual version staring back. His driver offered to take him to Queens, but David declined. Nina had said to show up as just David, not as David the millionaire. So he took the subway, something he hadn't done in probably 5 years. He got lost twice trying to figure out which train to take. And the whole experience was humbling in ways he hadn't anticipated. The community center was in a modest building wedged between a laundromat and a grocery store. The paint was peeling on the outside, and the windows had security bars. This was nothing like the gleaming office buildings David usually inhabited. Inside, the space was cramped but warm. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and about 15 people of various ages sat waiting. Nina stood at the front, talking with an older woman in a hijab, both of them laughing about something. When Nina saw David walk in, surprise flickered across her face. "You actually came," she said, walking over to him. "I said I would," David replied. "A lot of people say they will," Nina said. There was a story in those words, probably dozens of stories about volunteers who promised to help and never showed up. "I'm glad you're here. Come on, I'll introduce you." She led him to the circle. The students, that's what Nina called them, ranged from teenagers to people in their 70s. They were from everywhere: Syria, Somalia, Myanmar, Venezuela, Ukraine. Each face held a different story of why they'd ended up here, thousands of miles from home. "Everyone, this is David," Nina announced in English, then repeated it in what sounded like Arabic, then Spanish. "He's going to help with conversation practice today." A young woman from Venezuela raised her hand shyly. "Is okay my English is bad?" "Your English is great," David said automatically, then caught himself. That was exactly the kind of empty encouragement Nina had probably heard 1,000 times. "I mean, I'm here to help however I can. We'll figure it out together." Nina divided everyone into small groups. David ended up with 3 students: the young Venezuelan woman, an elderly man from Somalia, and a middle-aged Ukrainian woman he recognized from the gala. She recognized him too and smiled warmly. "You are the man from the party," she said in careful English. "You saw my husband and I speak." "I did," David confirmed. "Your story was very powerful. How are you both doing?" Her face lit up at the question, at being asked about herself rather than just her language skills. She told him about the apartment they'd found, about her husband starting a job at a restaurant, about how strange and wonderful and terrifying everything was. Her English was broken, full of pauses where she searched for words, but David found himself leaning in, genuinely interested. The Somali man, whose name was Ahmed, had been a fisherman his whole life. He was trying to learn English to get a job at a fish market in Brooklyn. He showed David pictures on his phone of the boats he used to work on, the ocean stretching endless behind him. "In Somalia, I know every fish," Ahmed said, his English halting but proud. "Here I know nothing. Must learn again." The Venezuelan woman, Valentina, was 19 and had left her family behind to escape political persecution. She was trying to get her high school equivalency diploma, but the language barrier made everything twice as hard. "In Venezuela, I was good student," she said quietly. "Here, I feel. How you say, stupid?" "You're not stupid," David said firmly. "Learning a new language while dealing with everything else you're dealing with? That's incredibly brave." Valentina's eyes watered. "Thank you," she whispered. For the next 90 minutes, David did something he'd never done before. He just listened. He helped when they asked for help with words, but mostly he listened to their stories. Ahmed talked about his grandchildren still in Somalia, about hoping to bring them here someday. Valentina talked about missing her mother's cooking, about how American food tasted like nothing. The Ukrainian woman talked about the sound of bombs, about how car alarms in New York still made her jump. David realized something during those conversations. These people weren't looking for pity. They weren't broken or helpless. They were survivors, warriors, people who'd crossed impossible distances and overcome unimaginable obstacles. They just needed someone to give them a chance to see past their accents and paperwork struggles to the humans underneath. When the session ended, Nina gathered everyone for tea. It was a tradition, apparently. They all sat together in the tiny kitchen area, drinking tea and eating cookies someone had brought. The conversation flowed in 6 languages, people switching between English and their native tongues without thinking about it. David watched Nina move through the group. She touched shoulders, laughed at jokes, switched languages as easily as breathing. With Ahmed, she spoke what David now recognized as Somali. With Valentina, rapid Spanish. With the Ukrainian woman and her husband, who'd arrived to pick up his wife, she spoke Ukrainian. Everyone relaxed around her, became more themselves. "She is Angel," Ahmed said to David, noticing him watching. "When I come here first time, I speak no English, nothing. I think I am too old to learn. She sit with me, 3 hours every week, teaching me, never impatient. Never make me feel bad. She's special," David agreed quietly. After everyone left, David helped Nina clean up. They worked in silence for a while, putting away chairs, sweeping the floor, washing the teacups in the small sink.